I think it would be accurate to say that the place where we experience our greatest joys and also our greatest heartaches is in our family. Some of life's greatest joys are things like watching our children and our grandchildren grow up, spending decades with a spouse who loves you and is there for you no matter what, sharing milestones and celebrations, birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. These are some of the greatest joys that we'll ever experience in life. But on the other hand, some of the most painful experiences that we go through in life are also found in the family. Divorce, conflict, sickness and death, those things in a family are among life's most painful of times. Well, in our text this morning, we're going to watch David go through one of the most painful times of his life. For the third time, he has to experience the death of a son. This time, it's Absalom. After his sister was raped, Absalom became a bitter man. And that bitterness and resentment led him to murder his brother Amnon and to develop this growing resentment toward his father David. He was angry that David didn't avenge Tamar's rape, but instead did nothing. He was angry that his father left him in exile for 3 years. And he was angry that even after he had been brought back to Jerusalem, his father still wouldn't meet with him for another 2 years. This growing resentment led Absalom to attempt a coup against his father's regime. And it probably would have been successful, except that Absalom took some bad advice, just as God intended. When we left off last week, Absalom had decided to gather this huge army from all over Israel. And then he led that army into battle to chase after David. But of course, all of that took time, which gave David the time that he needed to gather his forces and prepare for battle. And so we pick up this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 18 that says, David now mustered the men who were with him and appointed generals and captains to lead them. He sent the troops out in 3 groups. We see a few verses later that David gathered thousands of men for his army at this point. And he divided his army into these 3 divisions with the commander over each of them. David wanted to go out into battle himself, but his men talked him into staying somewhere safe until the battle was over. Because they knew that if David died in battle, it was all over. And so they wanted him to stay back where he's protected so they don't have to worry about him. And just let them fight the battle. And David agreed to this, but he gave his troops one very important instruction before they left. He said this. He said, "For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom." And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. And so David tells his 3 commanders that he wants them to spare his son Absalom, to go easy on him, don't kill him. And the narrator here tells us that everyone heard what he said. This wasn't whispered in some private meeting. It was understood by all the soldiers that David didn't want Absalom killed. Well, at this point in the story, I'm not really sure how to feel about David. On the one hand, I see a man who is filled with grace, who's willing to forgive his son despite everything that Absalom had done. And I understand that any parent would want to reconcile with their wayward child. But on the other hand, I think David was a bit deluded regarding his son. He seemed to believe that somehow, some way, there could still be this happy ending to this story, that somehow Absalom will change his mind and repent, and they'll be reconciled, and everything will just be wonderful. And I think it's impossible for David to see that, you know what, that's just not going to happen. Well, the next 3 verses tell us a little about the battle. It says, "So the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and the Israelite troops were beaten back by David's men. There was a great slaughter that day, and 20,000 men laid down their lives. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword." It's interesting to me that there are only 3 verses here that tell us about the actual battle. Imagine reading a book about, say, the Persian Gulf War, and all it had to say about the battle was the Iraqi forces were beaten back by the United States and their allies. There was a great slaughter, and 30,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed. Well, that leaves out a lot of important details. And that's what the narrator of 2 Samuel does. He leaves out all the details, because ultimately this story is not about war. It's not about battles. It's about people. Specifically, it's a story about Absalom and David. And so the battle itself only gets 3 verses. We aren't told much other than that the forces of Absalom, even though they were much greater in number, were still no match for David's army. David's men had spent over a decade as guerrilla fighters, and they knew exactly how to fight out in the wilderness. Absalom's soldiers didn't. And so one day of fighting, and the battle is over. Verse 9. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, his hair got caught in the tree. His mule kept going and left him dangling in the air. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that Absalom was not a very capable leader of his troops in battle. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Absalom would fit in well in the 21st century American politics. He had the charisma, he had the good looks, he had the political savvy, he had all the image. But when it was time to actually lead the troops, Absalom was rather inept. And so here he is, somehow all by himself in the forest, riding a mule. And it may seem strange that Absalom was riding a mule, that he was riding a mule into battle, but he was riding this mule to make it known that he was the new king. But somehow he got his head stuck in a tree. And his head, Now we realize we've always had these pictures of Absalom's hair getting stuck in the tree, and that would make sense because Absalom, we're told, had this long flowing hair. But that's not what the Hebrew says here. It says that he got his head stuck in a tree, literally. Either way, though, it was quite the predicament for Absalom. Verse 10 reads, one of David's men saw what had happened and told Joab, I saw Absalom dangling from a tree. What? Joab demanded. You saw him there and didn't kill him? I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt. Some have suggested that perhaps Joab had maybe put out a bounty on Absalom's head, and this is how how much the bounty was. Whoever kills Absalom gets the reward. And Joab says, hey, you could have claimed the reward. But the soldier, says, well, I would not kill the king's son for even 1,000 pieces of silver. We all heard the king say, for my sake, please spare young Absalom. And if I had betrayed the king by killing his son, the king certainly would have found out who did it, and you yourself would be the first to abandon me. And so this soldier says to Joab, hey, I don't care how much you offer me. I'm not about to kill Absalom. And his reasoning is this, that money is not going to do me any good, if I'm dead. And if the king finds out that I'm the one who disobeyed his order and killed his son, I know exactly what's going to happen to me. And then I love what he says next. He says, if the king finds out it was me who killed Absalom, and he wants to know why I did it, and I say because my commander Joab told me to do it, you're going to say, I don't know what this man's talking about. You're going to be the first to abandon me. And that may have been Joab's plan all along, to get somebody else to kill Absalom because he didn't want to do it because of how the king might react. And then when that person was brought before David, he could claim to be innocent. And that sounds about right to me. We've all seen how Joab was kind of this deceitful schemer, and that may have been what he was up to all along. Verse 14 reads, "Enough of this nonsense," Joab said. Then he took 3 daggers and plunged them into Absalom's heart as he dangled, still alive, in the great tree. 10 of Joab's young armor-bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Joab says, "Hey, if you're not going to do it, then I'll do it myself." And he stabs Absalom with 3 daggers. And then 10 other soldiers come up and they all put their spears or arrows into Absalom. And I think the reason for this is so that when the king says, "Which one of you killed my son?" it's not just one person. There's this whole group of people, and nobody knows who actually delivered the killing blow. Now, Joab could have saved Absalom. He didn't have to kill him. But Joab understood that Absalom was never going to repent. He knew that Absalom would continue to undermine David's administration as long as he was alive. And if Absalom had been spared, just think about how many more thousands of people would die. And so Joab felt that he had no choice, and he killed Absalom. Well, after this, 2 messengers were sent to David to tell him what happened, to let him know the outcome of the battle, and to let him know that his son, Absalom, was dead. The scripture goes on in verse 31 and reads, "Then the man from Ethiopia arrived and said, 'I have good news for you, my lord the king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you.' 'What about young Absalom?' the king demanded. 'Is he all right?' And the Ethiopian replied, 'May all of your enemies, my lord the king, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man.'" Which was the roundabout way of saying, "Your son is dead." Verse 33, "The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, 'Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son.'" In this moment, David was absolutely devastated. When Saul and Jonathan died, David offered up this wonderful tribute. When his own son, through Bathsheba, died, he offered up words of wisdom. But now, David is absolutely devastated and can say nothing other than to repeat, "My son, my son, my son." So I want to talk with you this morning about grief as we take a closer look at David's response to Absalom's death. And I want to begin by saying this, that grief is a natural response to losing someone or something that's important to us. It doesn't have to even be death. We may grieve because a loved one has died, or it may be because a relationship has ended, or a friendship, or a marriage. Or we may grieve because we've lost our job, or we've had some major health setback. But grief is a natural response to losing someone or something that is important to us. And that grief can feel overwhelming. You may feel like the life is just being sucked out of you. You may experience a heaviness that feels like it's just going to absolutely smother you. If you've ever had a significant loss in your life, you understand what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I don't really know if there's any way I can explain it to you just in a way that you'll understand just how overwhelming grief can be. The first reaction in our time of grief tends to be numbness. We find it difficult to concentrate because we feel so overwhelmed. Someone has suggested that the numbness that initially comes with grief is actually God's gift to us. It shields us from having to deal with the full implication of the loss all at once. That's one of the reasons you need to be careful about drawing conclusions about how someone is doing after seeing them at a visitation or the funeral home. The numbness most likely has not worn off yet. It's when the day-to-day nature of the loss hits home that grief may hit its hardest. And it's also important to note that people grieve differently. Grief just doesn't follow a predictable path or pace. There is no normal amount of time to grieve. The grieving process is going to be different according to our personality or our age, our physical and mental health, our support network. And it's also likely to be impacted by the type of loss that we have experienced. So we need to be very careful not to assume that we know how someone else is feeling in their time of loss. I mean, each person's experience is different. If you've gone through a similar loss, it will help you to empathize with someone else, but you'll never be able to fully understand how someone else feels because each person's experience is different. We see this in King David. In our study, we've seen David grieve over these 3 different sons who died. First there was the death of the baby born to Bathsheba as a result of David's adultery. When the baby was sick, David pleaded with God for the baby to be healed. But then when the child died, David got up and basically went on with his life. He knew that he couldn't bring the child back, and he believed that he would someday be reunited with that child. When Amnon died, David tore his clothes and wept, we were told. But the response to Absalom's death is even more intense. When David learns that Absalom has died, he's basically inconsolable. Now, why is there such a big difference? Well, again, it's because different people grieve in different ways. In fact, different situations may bring about a different kind of grief in the very same person. There are a variety of emotions that are connected to any grief situation, and no situation is the same. I mean, just think about what sort of emotions that David must have been feeling when he heard the news that Absalom was dead. I'm sure there was anger. David may have been angry at Absalom for creating this whole situation to begin with. He may have been angry at Joab for not protecting his son. He may have been angry at God for allowing it to happen. And he may have been angry at himself. Wherever we suffer loss, anger is a natural response. And then there's regret and remorse. David knew that his whole situation was partially the result of his own actions. I mean, what if he had been a better example to his son? What if he had never had that affair with Bathsheba? What if he had been more compassionate with Tamar after she was raped? What if he had refused to let those years go by when he had no relationship with his son? I mean, what if he had indulged his children less and taught them a deeper reverence for God and how to make wise choices in life? Whenever we experience loss, it's only natural that we look back with some degree of regret. And there's spiritual concern. When his baby died, David seemed pretty confident that his baby was now with the Lord. He may not have been so sure about Absalom. During the course of life, we sometimes don't give it a lot of thought to a person's spiritual destiny. But when you're standing over the casket or at a grave site, that issue is of utmost importance. Jesus promised that those who believe in him would live even though they die. Paul tells us that death is swallowed up in victory. And these are the kinds of truths that help comfort us in our times of loss. Truths that allow us to grieve, but not like others who have no hope. And then there's the emotion of loss. Anytime we lose someone due to death or divorce or any other circumstance, our hopes and our dreams tend to die with them. We think about the wedding that will never take place, or the grandchildren that will now never be born, the vacation that will never be taken, the anniversary that will never be celebrated. There's a loss of companionship. And grief often brings this deep sense of loneliness because we miss that person's company. And sometimes we don't realize just how much we cherish someone's companionship until they're gone. And then one more thing that we learn from David's reaction is that there is a danger that our grief can be consuming. Grief is such an intense emotion that it can just easily control your life. You can spend your whole life focused on that loss. And that was the direction I believe that David was headed. We pick things up in 2 Samuel 19 that says, word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had deserted in battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab went to the king's room and said to him, "We saved your life today and the lives of your sons, your daughters, and your wives and concubines. Yet you act like this, making us feel ashamed of ourselves. You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You've made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you would be pleased. Now go out there and congratulate your troops, for I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you will be worse off than ever before." And so we see here now how David's overwhelming grief was affecting the people around him. His soldiers felt rejected. These were men who chose to stand with David when his son opposed him. These were men who went to war willing to give their very lives in defense of their king. And they fought valiantly. They gained the victory for their king. But now the king's response made them feel like they'd done something wrong. They felt more like criminals rather than heroes. I think this was probably kind of similar to how our own American soldiers who fought in the Vietnam War felt when they returned home. It was a horrible conflict, yes. It was a time of devastating losses and horrible memories, just like any war is. And sadly, when those soldiers returned from Vietnam, they weren't given a hero's welcome with honor and applause and gratitude. Instead, they were scorned and vilified and spat upon. Many Americans hated that war, and they took it out on the soldiers. These men who had served honorably and faithfully were treated like they did something wrong. This was one of our country's, I think, most shameful times. And we can debate whether or not President Kennedy should have ever gotten us into that conflict, but we should never have treated those who chose to serve their country in such a shameful manner. Maybe many of the horrors of Vietnam would have been lessened if the soldiers knew they were appreciated for their service. I think David's men felt that same kind of rejection when they returned home from battle. Their commander-in-chief didn't give them a hero's welcome with honor, applause, and gratitude. No, all he could say was, "Why did you kill my son?" And Joab knew that something had to be done. And so he told David to stop crying and to go out and to thank his men for what they accomplished. Yes, David had lost a son, but he was still the king. And the people of Israel needed him. And David needed to step up. He needed to encourage his soldiers. I said earlier that grief can be overwhelming, and there's a tendency for grief to be all-consuming. But this is where we need to be careful. When we become consumed with grief, we oftentimes start to shut other people out. And unintentionally, we can make them feel like they're not very important to us. This can happen when a child dies. One parent may become so inconsolable that they alienate the rest of the family. And the other children begin to think, well, you may have lost a child, but you still have us. Doesn't that mean anything? And even the spouse can begin to feel neglected. It's a very common thing for couples to get a divorce after the death of a child for that very reason. And in our time of grief, we need to remember that we're not the only one who's hurting. Anytime someone dies, a lot of people are affected. And we get through these times not by isolating ourselves, but by helping each other. Because when we withdraw from people, we force them to deal with yet another loss, the loss of our friendship. When we experience a loss, our spouse, our children, our parents, our friends, they still need us. They need us to celebrate their victories, to share with them in their lives, to comfort them in sorrow, and to give guidance. And when we become consumed with our own grief, it can affect our relationship with others. Something else I think we can learn from Joab's conversation with David is this, that when we grieve, other people are watching. Other people are watching us. In our times of loss, we show the true nature of our faith. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should act like our loss doesn't hurt. Not at all. And I'm not suggesting that we tell everybody everything's fine when things are really not fine. But what I am suggesting is that when we suffer loss, we have an opportunity to demonstrate our faith in Jesus Christ and our trust in a God who will keep all of the promises that He's made to us. And so, what do we learn about grief from David? Well, each person's experience of grief is unique. And different coping strategies will work for different people. The most important thing is to allow yourself to experience the pain of loss. It's natural and normal to grieve. It's normal to feel overwhelmed and helpless at the idea of having to pick up your life and responsibilities on your own without the support of that person that you've depended upon and relied upon for so long. It's normal to feel angry toward the loved one who has left you behind, or toward life which has treated you so unfairly. It's normal to wonder if you'll ever feel happy again. Don't feel guilty about that. And don't be in a rush to get over it. Don't think you have to hide your grief and put on this brave face for others. Allow yourself to grieve and fully experience the feelings of grief. Grief doesn't follow a predictable path or pace. There is no normal amount of time to grieve. We may feel the effects of grief every day for 18 months after a major loss. And at times it will feel like the pain is just overwhelming or that it will never end. But over time, the intensity of grief will decrease. It will be less often at the forefront of our mind, even if the ache is still there in the background. And waves of grief may come and go over the months or even years. Reminders of loss, like the anniversary of a death or some familiar song, those things can trigger the return of grief. But nevertheless, over time, we will find ways to adjust to life in the absence of the person that we've lost. We learn to integrate our memories and our sorrow into who we are in our new reality. There's one more thing about David's response to Absalom's death that I want to look at as we close. Remember what he said? He said, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. And I think that's a rather common response whenever any parent finds out that their child has died. I wish that I had died instead of you. David wished with all of his heart that he could give his own life in exchange for Absalom. What King David was unable to do, the perfect king would do 1,000 years later. He would actually die in our place. You see, in this story, we are Absalom. We are the ones who wanted to be our own king. We put ourselves on the throne. We lived in rebellion. We wanted to do things our own way. And so we declared ourselves to be enemies of God. But while we were living at war with God, while we were trying to put ourselves on the throne, Jesus Christ died for us. We were the rebellious ones, but Jesus died in our place on that cross. He did for us what David wanted to do for Absalom, so that we might experience salvation and forgiveness of our sins.